Look at that plant. I want you to know that everything was grown in my garden. Don't touch that plant!
Is it poisonous?
She'll become part of the plant.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Flower Power Garden Hour. I'm your host, Marlene, and tonight we are going to be talking natives, California natives more specifically, because I'm in California. I'm a California native myself. But what does that mean exactly? Is it a great thing to plant them? Is it the only thing you should be planting? Why is it so important? There's sort of a lot of questions around California natives. You think, oh, they must be native, or they're native. They must be easy to grow. Well, not always. Yes, sometimes. But with me is Patricia Carpenter, who is one of my garden mentors, and Pat Dressendorfer, who I have actually yet to meet, but I've heard about her for a very long time. Her and Patricia garden together, and they've recently written a series of articles together. So you could say, yes, they are experts in California natives. Thanks for joining me, both of you.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
So before we
I'm sorry, I'm laughing.
I
don't think of myself as a mentor, Marlene, but okay.
Of course. Oh, yeah. I still refer to your garden and how I helped you in your garden. And I still use a lot of the practices you use and you taught me. So yeah, of course. You're probably
Okay.
more of a mentor to more people than you realize. But, you know, I know you don't like to toot your own horn. So we have to do it for you. So
Thanks.
I do like to always get people's backgrounds before we get right into it. And of course, we're talking gardening. So I always have to just have, brief or interesting stories about how the heck you got into gardening. And, you could just carry it along to the transition of natives as well. And Patricia, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. So I've been gardening now for about 50 years. I realized that it was almost 50 years ago that I had a garden plot at the UC Davis Community Garden, which is now the ARC parking lot. So it's been almost 50 years, hard to believe. But my grandparents and my father were all farmers, so I think I just had the genes. As far as natives go, I didn't get into natives. Well, I hiked all over and I lived in the country and that, so I saw natives, but I didn't know natives until I helped in some school gardens in the 90s. In the fourth grade, they learned about native people of California, and I threw in native plants. And that's when I started focusing more on native plants. The garden that we have here was not started until 2005 on the slough. And that's the garden that Pat and I do together. And that's when we really learned a lot about natives.
And Pat, how did you begin gardening?
Yeah, maybe similar to Patricia. 50 plus years ago, I was doing some gardening. I had a grandfather who raised oranges in Orange, California, and hung out with him some. And through the years, just did some regular kind of gardening. And then as I got older, I was hiking and I began to appreciate all the different plants along the sides of the trail. And I later became interested in ecology at UC Davis and got a graduate degree in that. And that led me to understand more about the importance of plants. I'd always thought animals were pretty important, and I neglected to realize that you got to have those plants in any sort of ecological cycle. And Patricia, I already told you we met at school, and I ended up working with her for many, many years in a 1-acre garden that she began developing, and I became very interested in. So at that point, we learned lots.
Yeah. So Patricia, I just sort of want to have you expand on your garden a bit, because you live, in the city, outside the city of Davis, where, UC Davis is at. And you have, I think it's an acre of your own. And, you had your traditional garden, and then you just started taking over some land slowly. And
I am hardcore guerrilla gardener. I have taken over bits of land all over the world. And so there's an acre behind us on a slough that belongs to another neighbor. And one day I said, can I just sort of sneak out into here and do some things too? And that slowly over probably 5 years turned into taking over about an acre. And that was 2005, and we worked on it for some years. Pat joined me about maybe 2009, 10, and then a 5-year sort of hiatus to New Zealand, where Pat took over the garden during those 5 years that I was gone, although I came back to help out. And then lastly, our new garden experiment is on a bike path on the other side of my house, where we're trying to test out just how little water somebody can use in a garden, native garden.
Yeah. And of course, we're going to talk about, the importance of gardening during a drought, and California is a drought state and it's becoming more so. But before we get into that, I just want to briefly bring up, you guys did a series of articles. For what publication? And tell me a little bit about that.
Well, maybe I'll start first. Pacific Horticulture asked us to write a series of articles. And since I had already become a garden ambassador for the California Native Plant Society, and Pat and I decided what we really wanted to do were seasonal rambles, garden visits that emphasize each season, of which we think there are 5. And so we did the articles the same. We did one article for each of the 5 seasons. And the best part of it is that Pat and I were not Pat wasn't in Davis during that whole time that we were writing these articles. And so we had a lot of connection that we wouldn't have had. And it was so fun to reflect back on how we got to where we got to and all the problems and fun things and successes that happened along the way.
Well, I'm going to have to ask, because I'm counting on my fingers. I'm like, summer, winter, fall, spring.
Okay, Pat.
Well, there's winter. That makes sense. And there's summer. That makes sense. There's fall. That makes sense. But we decided to divide spring into 2, early spring and late spring.
Got it.
Because they're really quite different.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, we always get a false spring. Is that sort of what you're talking about? Like our spring starts like in February?
Well, I think
it's early spring.
Yeah, that's part of it. But it's also spring goes over more than its share of time in terms of what starts to bloom in spring in the valley here and what continues blooming all the way into what we would call summer.
Got it. Okay, so that
if you want to put months on it, we say early spring is February, March, mm-hmm. and it's cold, it's rainy still, things are green, and things are happening. Whereas April, May, late spring, things are just kind of totally crazy. Things are starting to dry out. It's starting to get hot. It's like 2 different seasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I find that a lot of people fall for the February spring being the actual spring where temperatures are stabilized, especially, getting your vegetable gardens in. But yeah, that's a good point. Cause spring, you're right. It does. We do have this whole burst of things blooming in this early spring. And then we have a burst of things blooming in later spring. And, a lot of times it's dries out in that second half of spring. So, but I just wanted to make sure, because people are like, what are they talking about? There's not 5 seasons.
I know.
What?
And to make things even worse, we don't consider the other seasons a typical calendar season. We put 4 whole months of summer. Mm-hmm. So June, July, August, and September, we have 4 months of summer. Then we have about. Do you agree?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. And I'm even thinking pushing half of October into it sometimes.
Well, I gave October and November fall because at least some new growth comes. And then we have a whole 2 months of winter. I mean, that's not typical of the rest of the world.
No, people are hating us right now when you said we have 2 months of winter. People who just got a late snow. I think Portland just got hit by snow, so I don't think they're too happy. I have gardener friends up there who are taking some hits with their plants up there. But yeah, that's good to know that
But
go ahead.
I was just going to say, to make them feel better, we had a frost, a little mini frost, but April, a mini frost, so my potatoes aren't as happy as they were.
Yeah, and people who planted their veggies a little too early. And we have a big ag area too. So these frosts can hit and it could be very detrimental versus just our garden. So, because it is such a big ag state. But let's get into the nitty-gritty of exactly what natives are, why it's important. So basically, a California native is a plant that's endemic to this state, and it's a big state, so that can cause a little issues when people are picking natives for their yard. But why is it important? And if you have go ahead and give me a better explanation and definition of a native. Absolutely have no problem with you taking that and running with it. But why are they so important? Hear people, oh, it's important to plant natives. But I don't know if people understand the reasons why.
Okay, well, I totally agree with you. The idea of how do you define a native is always kind of been sort of nebulous to me, because a California native has to do with California's border. Mm-hmm. And if you go up to Northern California and then you go into Oregon, you have the same plant communities on both sides of that man-made, border. So, but they get called Oregon natives when they grow up there, and the plants don't know where they're growing or what state they're in. There's so much diversity in California, and the advantages of planting natives get magnified if people are careful, if they can be careful, and you can't always do this, to plant the natives that were originally growing in the place where we live. Well, that works well in some places, but in the Sacramento Valley, we would have, in Davis where we are, we'd have valley oaks and we'd have tules, and we would have those kinds of plants. And a lot of people really want to plant a redwood or something like that, which is a California native. So the advantages of planting a native, that also varies a lot. And I know a lot of people tout the natives as being so important because some of them are drought tolerant, and that's what we're looking at now. Redwoods are not. They need a lot of water, and all the coastal plants do too. On the other hand, the desert plants can do well in low water. So there's an advantage there for natives if you pick the right one for where you live. I think most plants provide habitat and food for some sort of living thing, whether it's human or otherwise. And a lot of the non-native plants can do that quite well. A lot of flowers will feed butterflies. But if you're looking at more of the success of and providing good habitat for a variety of native species, that's where the real plus comes in to planting native plants, because it's not just a lot of these species that we're trying to support in our gardens, like the butterflies and the bees and the beetles even, they have a life cycle that's quite more complex than a lot of people think of. Sure, the butterflies will get pollen and nectar off of many, many different kinds of plants, whether they're native or not. But when it comes to another part of their life cycle, like the caterpillar stage, some of them are very dependent on a particular species of plants that's native. And, we all hear about the monarch and the milkweed and the pipevine swallowtail butterfly and its pipevine plant. But there are a lot of them that one stage of their life cycle, you have to have a certain thing. And the elderberry beetle in California has to have its elderberry to lay its eggs in the stem of the plant so that you can get the next generation. So if you plant natives, you're covering more bases for ensuring that animals that need that plant get all of their needs met.
I think that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest advantage. Can you think of anything else?
No, that was well said.
Okay.
Yeah, because
That's
so
good.
so we're gonna go into the drought, but it's also people are like, well, I bought this plant and it says it's good for butterflies, but you're bringing in
Mhm.
that we want to support the native butterflies, the native um,
Mhm.
fauna that is here, and once again, that's actually important because one, you don't want to see these things go um, um, extinct, but it also those are the ones that help to balance out everything. Those are the ones that are going to be predators for the pests. Those are the ones that are going to allow our ecosystem to thrive how it is. It keeps everything in balance. So, besides not wanting these species to disappear, we want a healthy ecosystem. And I'm glad you mentioned the monarchs and the milkweeds because and I know people who are, researching monarchs and support monarchs, the stress of, and I'll just say it here, is the stress of getting the proper milkweed out. You see milkweed and you go, oh, but there's that tropical milkweed that a lot of people are planting. And that's actually not a California native. So it gets a little tricky when you have these same genus, same common name, and people see it. Maybe the nurseries are marketing it wrong, and then they plant it. So you need the California, the Asclepius, speciosa, I think is one of them. Linearis, I think is another one. But yeah, it's important to keep the balance going.
Mhm.
Patricia, did you have any
Yeah.
input or you like what she said?
No, I agree with every single thing you guys said.
Well, there's one thing that I might add too. It's more than just keeping these species from becoming extinct. With the case of bees, most of our agriculture depends on some sort of pollination
Yes.
from some sort of bee.
Mhm.
And at this point, the future of the European honeybee, which has been doing most of the pollinating, has sort of in jeopardy. There's some problems with colony collapses and stuff like that. On the other hand, some of our native bees, like the mason bees and things like that, can take over for the honeybee and actually do a better job of pollinating our orchards and other plants than the European bee. But if we don't provide the appropriate habitat at the right time, which is now, to keep these bees abundant, then we won't be able to have them as a backup for our agriculture. And there's lots of other examples of other bees that can do that too. But it's good for agriculture too.
Yeah, an excellent point. And then I guess the big one too is, you see this in, like Hawaii, where, they don't have many native plants necessarily,
Mhm.
but then people bring in these non-natives and they just start taking over, like lantana.
Mhm.
So another reason to plant natives is you don't have, a plant that all of a sudden is like, wow, this environment is phenomenal for me, and I'm just gonna take over and move all these natives out.
Wait a second here.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily true.
Ooh,
There's
okay.
a lot of plants in our garden that take over. And so just because it's a native doesn't mean it's going to work.
No,
They're
I think there's a
sometimes,
lot.
yeah,
yeah, no,
they're sometimes not real polite, those natives. They will take over from each other
yeah, but
and become
Yeah.
invasive also.
yes, no, I agree with that 100%. But I think the whole, oh my gosh, I planted this and it's not native and it's taking over. I guess it sounds better when you're like, wow, this native really took over my other natives.
Okay. Agreed.
Yeah.
You're just
Yeah.
like, nothing I could do. It's native. It's happy here, right? So
Just wants to be here.
Just wants-
Okay.
Okay. So I do want to go back to where Pat was saying that, like Northern California and Oregon almost are more similar and, to plant communities than, Central California, where you're saying there's oaks and grasslands and of course the deserts. So California, I remember taking a California plant communities class in when I was in school. And because it's a big state, there's a lot of different plant communities. So this is am I wrong, or is people should know what plant community they're in, plant ecosystem they're in, biome they're in, and choose plants accordingly? So is this where we run into problems where the people get disgruntled with natives because they see a sign that says natives and then they buy it, but it's like a fern and they're trying to plant it in the Central Valley.
I'd say, yes, certainly.
Yeah. But you can, as Patricia has done exceptionally well in her native garden, you can tweak that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
There are ways of creating shade for the plants that like shade, even though there probably wasn't a lot of shade in this valley originally. And there are ways of changing your microclimates enough that you can, plant on the shady side of some other plant rather than the sunny side. And there are some people who think, oh yeah, we're in the Sacramento Valley, we can only plant Sacramento Valley natives. Well, that's maybe not the most interesting garden for most of us to have. So, we push the boundaries on that a lot. And Patricia's garden has, Patricia, I don't know how many different species, but from lots of different communities.
Right. We're probably definitely over about 400 species / cultivars in our garden at this point, and from quite a few areas. Only because I researched the Central Valley, and okay, we could have some geophytes or bulbs, we could have some grasses, we could have some annuals, and a few perennials. And because we're on a slough, we could have some sort of riparianness, valley oaks and some of those things. That's it. No ceanothus. I don't know if there's any ceanothus in the Central Valley. There might be, but not the pretty ones that you see in the nurseries for sure. So I decided to plant several plant communities instead. And because we're on a slough and we have a north-facing and a south-facing slope, we have, like Pat said, some extra microclimates that we can play with. So on a north-facing slope, which is also next to our redwoods, it's a lot cooler there. And so we plant coastal things. They could be considered coastal scrub. It could be coastal chaparral, or it could be coastal prairies. We kind of lump them together. But when I get into slopes, that might be a little more chaparral-y. And as I'm creeping to the redwoods, that's a little different too. But in all cases, we try to give them afternoon shade because they're from a coastal and not so intense heat area like the Central Valley. We have redwoods, like I said. We have desert. That's on a south-facing slope, and it's really hot. It's really dry because it's on a slope. Our clay soil is actually good drainage, so we can tweak it a bit. We also have a foothill area on a south-facing slope, but that one's got a little bit more shade from some oak trees. We have a big blue oak out in the field close to our valley grassland. And in the blue oak area, we also plant plants that like to be in a blue oak area. But big oaks have a shady side and a sunny side. And if you plant those properly, you can grow a lot more things. And is that all of them? I think so. So, I could have just planted what's local. And there are a lot of things here, but I chose not to. Actually, to be fair, Marlene, the very first plant section I planted, I had no idea there was even such a thing as a plant community. I now call that I had no idea what I was doing section. It's got customs everywhere. And then all of a sudden I learned that and I went, oh, boy, what a good way to group these. They have similar needs. This is a good plan. And that's when I started getting things right a little bit better. But oh my gosh, I had no clue.
Yeah. And most people are not going to be gardening to the size that you are. But if anyone has even a little bit of a slope, utilize that. If it's a sunny slope, like you're saying, that's where your native desert plants are at. If you have a shady slope, that's where maybe your coastal scrub will go if it's in the afternoon. If you have a tree, use the shade of the tree to try to get maybe some of your redwood forest type plants, and not necessarily, even if you have a redwood, your shady plants. So utilize those areas. Do you agree, Pat?
Absolutely. You have to if you want to be successful. Yeah.
Yes. I like how Patricia.
It really makes it better. Yeah.
Yeah. I like how Patricia's like, wow, I came up with something. I wonder if people know about. But I mean, that's what gardeners do. We do things, we learn from it, we make mistakes, and then it's like, oh, that makes sense now.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, it was a I don't know. I just all of a sudden one day stumbled upon it, went, oh, this makes sense. I think I was in Jepson. What's this community stuff? Okay.
Yeah,
Anyway.
And your place is amazing because you inherited redwood trees that were already there. And we're talking about redwood trees, how they're native, but they're native to the coastal areas, cooler areas, but yours look beautiful. And you're utilizing that area as like a redwood forest. And then you walk and then you have like this grassland, and then you walk and then you have, like you said, so I mean, it's almost like you're seeing a lot of these communities just in your 1 acre. So it's a pretty darn amazing place, and you guys done a great job. One thing I do, I talk about at work, and trying to get people to look at plants and letting them almost tell you. So say you have a plant and there's no information on it at all, letting sort of the plants tell you where they want to go. And one thing I find fascinating is just the morphology of natives. And you could almost tell what community they're in by how they look, sometimes how they smell. Can you talk a little bit about like how your plants vary, the morphology, the physiological characters of them based on what communities, and just some of the personal traits of these plants?
I guess I could do that. Well, the easiest ones are evergreen shrubs, because if you have thick, leathery leaves, it resists dehydration. And so they're probably going to be in the foothill or in a chaparral type area, and they're going to probably be in the sun. If they have gray leaves or white leaves, like same thing, that reflects light. That means they're not going to dry out as much. That's probably the same area. Or little hairs and oils also protect. If they have small leaves that are kind of upright, that means it's not going to be as much sun on them. All of those things mean probably hot, dry, less water. But then you go to the ferns. Not all ferns go under redwoods, but a lot of them do. And if the plant is like really succulent, it needs water most likely. There are definitely exceptions. Did I forget anything? Oh, well, all our bulbs have storage units. The bulb itself, or the tuber, or the taproot are all storage units, which means they can all shut down when it gets too hot and there's no water, but they come back the next year. Annuals do the same thing, but in a different way. They just reseed like crazy. There's one thing that doesn't quite fit this characteristic, but something that we found that caused us a lot of grief. There are summer and winter deciduous plants in California. So if you have a plant that is summer deciduous, meaning that it's going to shut down during the hot summer, whether it's a shade plant or a sun plant. So you've got this plant that's all of a sudden crinkly and looks like it's dying. You panic. Well, we did lots of panicking at first. And then we realized it's summer deciduous. That's how the plant's shutting down. So,
I mean, the one that comes to mind for me is the, of course, I'm not the horse chestnut, the
California buckeye.
Thank you. So that's one of them. That starts going deciduous late summer. What are some others that you've noticed?
Ferns.
Oh, okay. I could see that.
Definitely ferns. We have ferns in the redwoods that are summer deciduous, and we have some that are winter deciduous.
And I can see
I don't know.
And the bulbs, they die back, some of them starting now.
Oh, yeah.
They don't even wait for summer to die back. They shut down as soon as they lose their water, but they'll come back next year. So
yeah,
it's a way of conserving water when they live in a place where there's not as much rainfall.
Yeah, it's always amazing when, you go hiking in the lower elevations in California, and then you go hiking, say, in Washington in July, or, the Alps in July. And that's when their annual flowers are just having a field day. And you're like, well, that was about 5, 6 months ago for us,
Yeah.
just because of the low water. But the ferns, that is such a good, important fact, because I could just see everyone watering them to death
Mm-hmm.
when they're wanting to go dormant. You see a fern and you're like, hey, fern wants water. Okay, let's just keep watering this thing. When in fact, that is a defense stress or just adaptation. It's made to go dormant when it starts drying out. So that's interesting because, yeah, I know the
And
buckeye.
I was just going to say, under the redwoods, the ones that are summer deciduous under the redwoods, they still get water, but they still die.
Mhm.
And there are some that are low water ferns that can do either way. I mean, you really got to learn this stuff eventually, or you get pretty freaked out. I mean, we generally didn't learn it at the beginning. We learned it because, wait, what's going on? Why? Pat and I always go, why? What's going on? How come this isn't working?
Well, and it's also the whole, I'm not throwing that plant away until I've given it a good year to be right there and see what it does. I always tell people, it's like, well, a lot of times plants will die from the top. Just, be patient. If it's, still viable, might come back from the base. So don't give up. Before we get into, step by step, how people could go about prepping their garden, plants that you would recommend, and of course, watering. Let's just hit some of and we've already talked about some of the misconceptions, but what are some mistakes? I mean, you've said you've mentioned plenty that you've done. Mistakes, misconceptions people have about natives, make about natives. What are some main ones that you've come across people saying like, oh, really? Oh, I thought this, I thought that.
Okay, I'll do a few of those on Patricia Canadian. One of the things that some people do that's a definite mistake is they dig, or you can do it better than digging with a shovel. Dig with a fork, because it breaks up the soil and it keeps the integrity of the soil that the plant's going to have to grow in anyway more intact if you do that. Another thing is when you dig a hole, well, you should dig a hole that's twice as big as the plant. Don't put any amendments in it, because the natives don't do well with adding a whole lot of mulch or any of that kind of stuff to the hole that you're digging for the plant. That's probably something that a lot of people do. Other people might want to fertilize them. And natives in general, and with our clay soils that have so many nutrients, don't need fertilizer. It's really important to plant them at the right depth. A lot of times people will dig a hole and they put the plant in, and because the soil's sort of fluffy when they put it in, the plant will sink. And that means that the dirt's going to come up around the stem of the plant in a way that shouldn't have happened if the plant had propagated itself naturally in a natural setting where it would grow the way it might want to. And one of the other mistakes that they make is that you buy a plant that says low water, and everybody says, oh, plant natives, you don't have to water them, but you really do have to water them at first. When you first put them in, you have to give them a lot of water at the time you plant, maybe a gallon. If it's a 1 gallon plant, give them 5 gallons of water. And that seems like a lot, but that's important. And then you have to keep checking to see that the soil around that plant is moist, at least through the first winter season, when it can be putting roots down deep, because that's what you want a native plant to do, is have the option of going with deep roots. That's what makes it drought tolerant in the future. But you can't put it in and just think it's going to grow with no water. It's not, that doesn't work. Yeah. Patricia, you got more?
We've covered most of that, but yeah, I would say the slope part, I think, is really important. I mean, growing on a slope, it's easy. We started on a slope and I just patted myself because everything worked so well. But then we had a flat land and all of a sudden things did not work so well. And so I thought, okay, why? Well, because you have to plant really high. Most of those drought tolerant plants don't want a lot of water around the crown of the plant where the top and the bottom meet. And so, like Pat said, if it ends up in a hole, you can count on that thing not being happy. So when I actually plant a shrub or a tree, I take my digging fork, and if there happens to be wood chips, a mulch on the top, we don't ever want to dig wood chips in. I spread the wood chips away from where I want to plant. I use my digging fork and I loosen up that complete soil, 6 by 6 for a shrub. And yes, wow. And I don't turn it over because we want to keep the natural layering of the soil, like Pat said. And then I just go into the center and I almost put the plant, right on top of the soil. If I'm assuming it's a gallon plant, maybe a little farther. And then I bring all that nice soil up to the plant. And so it's going to be up a bit. This is in the flatlands, in the soil, on the slopes you've got it made. And so you're pulling all that up. So 3 or 4 things happen when you plant like that. Number one, you've got a plant that's fairly high and then slopes out. You can put a lot of mulch on that area up to the plant. If you want to kill the plant, just dump a whole bunch up against it. But you feather it out just around the plant and you put a lot of mulch. That means a lot of weeds won't grow. But if a weed grows, look, you've got 6 feet that you've already loosened the soil. Number 2, you didn't make a hole with a shovel, which is like making a pot, put your plant in, water it right there. There was no place for those roots to go. Whereas I have a whole bunch of places that is actually going to accept water, and it's got plenty of room for the roots to go. So if you plant like that, you have a really good chance of succeeding. If you instead dig a hole with a shovel, put a plant in, it accidentally goes down lower, you put one drip line, one emitter, your plant is not off to a very good start.
Got it. No, those are great tips. So and that just makes me think, if someone was removing their lawn in their backyard, and I see all these steps that people want to take. They want to bring in the yards of compost. They want to bring in the rototiller. They want to rototill it down. So you're saying
don't do any of that.
Don't do any of that. If you have clay soils,
No.
which most people have, or if you're in more
Fine.
like a central, Sacramento, where you have sandy loam, oh my gosh, even better. Just simply dig a wider hole, like you said, with the digging fork, because that sort of keeps it doesn't shear off those sides of the holes. And
Right.
Don't dig any deeper than the root ball. In fact, plant a little bit higher. So there's no need to bring in all this compost.
Not at all.
No need to rototill. Just,
No,
dig
that's
the grass
worse.
up. Yeah. And then just throw some compost on top to help smother weeds. But like you said, don't put it right up against the plant, because in the wild, a lot of these plants don't have any organic matter up against them. Think about chaparral plants, like you were saying, a slope is, water just drains off. But so those are great. I think people love to hear, oh, I don't have to go to all this trouble and expense of prepping.
Nope.
Yeah.
If you're going to spend your money on anything, on a decent digging fork, which, by the way, has a square tines, not flat tines, that's a potato fork, and get yourself some wood chips to mulch with, and then spend your money on some fun plants.
I think there's another thing that we haven't talked about yet is how do you get water to your plants?
Okay.
Because most people are not going to go out there with their watering can and water each plant individually according to that plant's needs. If you can, in your design of the garden, if you can group the plants according to their water needs, it will make it a lot easier to install some sort of an automatic irrigation system, because all the plants in a certain area would want the same type of water. It's kind of like making a plant community, but you can do that on a very small scale in a house garden, a small yard. But you got to think about it a little bit ahead of time, what plant you're going to put where based on their water needs.
Yeah, that makes sense. And not just, if you have a little bit of lawn and then you have these plants, don't have it go on at the exact same time, same duration as your little bit of lawn, or even I consider rose bushes pretty darn drought tolerant. So if we're talking drought tolerance, but even less. When is a good time to plant natives?
Well, we try to plant in the fall. as much as we can, especially our experiment on the bike path. I usually plant those in December. I do haul a bucket of water and give them a good watering, and then I hope that I don't have to water them again. But trees and shrubs usually need a couple of years to get established, which means in the summer I need a few more buckets of water. You can plant in the spring, and we have been successful, but you have to be on top of things. Mm-hmm. We use a system of flags. We put blue flags on things that are still establishing and need a little extra water so that we don't forget. I mean, sure, we have an acre. It's easy to forget a plant, but even in a regular garden, you forget plants are there that you've put in. So
it's really important to water your plants enough their first year or two, depending on the plant, so that the soil stays wet down a ways. Because if the soil dries out a foot down and you're only watering the top foot, what happens is the roots won't grow down where it's dry. They'll grow out laterally to the sides. And you really do need to keep the soil wet down deeper. And that means infrequent watering, but watering often enough that the water gets down deep. And you can test that in a variety of ways. You can use, Don Shore loves to tell people to use a screwdriver, a long 18-inch screwdriver, and put it in the ground. And when it doesn't go any further, then you've hit dry dirt. There's other soil testers. But that's really important to keep that moist the first couple of years. If you don't do that, what you're going to get is roots that grow along the surface of the soil. And your plant, even though it's supposed to be drought tolerant, won't be, because the surface roots are going to dry out real fast whenever there's no rainwater. So watering it at the beginning is just awful important.
Yeah, so I like that you're pointing out that even though a lot of these that you're planting are probably drought tolerant, it doesn't mean you put them in the ground and you forget about it. Maybe if you plant in the fall and we get a lot of rain that winter, then that is a good thing and they could be established. But like you said, for larger trees and shrubs, they're going to need a couple of years of that, and you're going to need to help them through the summer to get those roots really down deep. But with that said, sometimes I find that I find that it's almost sometimes the winter rains can be more detrimental than summer, especially. So these plants are adapted to having great drainage. So there is cases where your soil could be pretty heavy and we get rains and the plant then comes out of it and like ceanothus, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I found like I lost 7 ceanothus in one year because it was a heavy winter year. They were on more of a flat lands. And when you see them when you see them in the areas in their natural area, they're more on a slope. So it just stresses the plant, and they literally died within weeks of each other, and they're in different areas, but all the flat lands. And in the summer, I didn't water them at all. So, I mean, that probably was stressing them as well, but it seemed like a heavy winter rain with a plant in a flat area in clay soils. Sort of, can that stress plants out?
Certainly.
Maybe.
But I mean, then we have to look at.
There's a few other factors here, but I agree, Pat. Right. Go ahead.
But the ceanothus is a plant that doesn't like a lot of water, and it doesn't even like summer water at all, usually, once it gets established and the roots are down. But it may not be well adapted to our flat clay soil. And it's hard to figure out the solution to that. Well, they're beautiful in the spring. Of course, nurseries sell them.
Yeah. And it's so sad because they get to a beautiful size. And I just had a friend, she's like, what can we do? And I'm like, it's dead. And I said, see that one 3 feet down? It's going to die in 2 years too. And it's just sad because, they grow so fast and they're so beautiful. And that's one that just comes to mind. I mean, there's few others that we try and try. Like, I know Patricia showed me the the woolly blue curls. My aunt had that in her ranch, and it was just on this shale, like granite, rocky slope, and it was perfectly happy. But I know that one's difficult to keep alive. So I guess that's,
unless you ignore it.
oh, see, there you go. So a lot of these plants want no summer irrigation once established or very little, but also just
Right.
be aware if you're on planting it, it's just a flat clay area that the winter rains themselves can be
Yeah.
detrimental. No.
I'm agreeing to a certain extent.
Okay.
But if you've planted it high
Mhm.
and you've made it so it's not puddling around, I think that's enough drainage because I've had quite a few ceanothus on flat areas. I think there's a couple other things that could possibly go wrong. For instance, if you prune ceanothus when they're bigger than about pencil size, you at the wrong time of year, you're getting infections that that can happen. So I do prune my ceanothus often up to more shrub, tall tree shrubs. But I'm going under there after they bloom and I'm cutting all the little tiny stuff then, not wait until, like next fall when you shouldn't. So I think that's another thing. There's something we don't all talk about, but we should. I just killed a ceanothus. I planted it. It's my fault. I planted it well. It was thriving. It's about 3 years old. And I looked down there and said, okay, was it the drought? Did I do this? Did I do that? Curling roots, circulating roots.
Yeah.
And you could see it. It had just uncovered itself and you could see the circle. Way back when we started the garden and there weren't that many people planting natives, many of the nurseries didn't do as good a job of, selling them before they were over. What's the right word, Marlene? They're too far gone.
Up potting them to a bigger pot.
They're pot bound. Yeah, they're root bound.
They're pot bound.
Yeah,
but circling. And if you plant it, you don't notice it for a few years, and then it all of a sudden girdles it. And or if the root's already kinked a little bit, and then it grows more, then it just doesn't get any water to it because it's kinked. So there it was.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. And that's why your wider hole is actually a really good idea because you could get a really good root system. And it's not like you were saying when you do just this shovel hole, like you're saying, you're almost making a small pot and the roots are going to continue that. So it's a good idea to loosen the roots. Buy good, nursery stock, of course. And we'll talk about nurseries and where to buy your plants in a bit. One misconception or one, just comment I hear a lot of is, oh, I planted natives, but they only look good for a small amount of time.
Okay, that was my next one.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Why you're saying they only look good because they don't understand seasonality?
Well, you tell me what you think.
That's what I think. Okay, go on.
No, you hear a lot of, it's going back to our season, our flowering season, of course, is early because then a lot of these plants, like you said, some of them go into dormancy. Some of them then are already putting, fruit on, and people equate looking good flowers with look good. Yes.
And so when we wrote this series of articles, we were trying to show show people that we embrace seasonality. And yeah, sure, spring is fun. It's, lots happening, lots of flowers, but in the winter, the fungus and the frost and the quietness of the fog, there's all really cool things that happen. In the summer, we had a bee expert come out in July at our garden, and he actually found, I think we counted 75, 90 flowers blooming. Yeah, there was one or two. So it happens even in the summertime. But what we forgot to tell you is, Pat and I wrote these articles, but a professional photographer, Beth Savage, found us in 2020, and her photographs make these articles. And she has photographed, like our fall article, all these textures that we have, all these pods, all the fun things that happen, all the leaves that fall on the ground. These are all cool things if you just pretend they're flowers. And I mean, they make me happy, but we just have to educate people, which is why we wanted people to come during those time frames so that they could see that the garden is still interesting.
Yeah. And, and I mentioned to you, I'm like, that berries and fruits and fall color, there is fall color, and some of these do produce nice berries. So if people need that, they need the color, they need the berries. A lot of natives can do that. You're saying though, just look at the structure of the plants, look at what's happening in the garden, maybe take it all as once, take the whole cycle, the whole year cycle as something that's beautiful and the plant's giving you. I always joke that if a flower was constantly green and in bloom, we would call it an oleander and we wouldn't like it. So it's the changing of the plant. It's when it's in bloom, that's the special part, but then seeing it reemerge from spring. So
I agree.
I guess it's trying to get people away from, I'm a big flower, fanatic. So it's hard, I love flowers, but I guess that's what makes the natives extra special is they do put on this horrendous bloom in spring and it's amazing, but you have to give them that. It takes a lot of energy. Then they have to do their thing and, watch them grow and watch the bees, watch the insects that utilize them, plant things maybe that you are going to have a little more quote interest than just, leaves falling off.
Well, I was going to say our desert area doesn't even come alive until late spring, summer. Our desert's gorgeous all summer long because, desert is hot and dry. And if you actually water it occasionally in the summertime, it's even happier. So
maybe incorporate different areas if you can, if you have the spot. So from different communities, if you're able to utilize that in a small space.
Yeah. And we haven't even talked about grasses here, but some of the grasses, the flower heads on the grasses are absolutely beautiful into the fall, and they can provide some interest in the garden.
Can I just throw this out there, put you guys on the spot? What are some of the California grasses that you like?
Oh, I know. Our top one, June grass.
Yeah.
So is that your top, Pat?
Well,
oh yeah,
it was as a non-grass person, Patricia, when I was in your yard, I'm like, what is that grass? I like that grass. And you're like, it's June grass. I'm like, that it looks like it's well behaved.
It is well behaved. And what happened is in my I didn't know what I was doing section, I tested quite a few grasses there. Why I was testing them, I don't know, but I was curious if there was such a thing as a well-behaved grass. And it turns out there's a few. And June grass was so well-behaved that there was a time in our valley grassland where we put it that it didn't outcompete the blue-eyed grass, which isn't truly a grass, but that's one of the plants out there. And we actually had to kind of get the blue-eyed grass to be not so happy and try to encourage the June grass to reseed more. That's the kind of grass you want. You don't want the ones that take over, which we have a few of. The second, maybe my second favorite would be maybe alkali grass.
Okay.
Pat and I both like that one. It'll take water, but it also is very drought tolerant. It's part of our valley grassland and our desert section. What's it called? Succotan, alkaline, succotan. Can't remember, but
Alkali,
something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Do we have another favorite grass?
Well, this isn't a grass, but I really like that flat bladed rush that we have growing.
Yes.
It's fabulous, and the seed head on that is just spectacular.
So is that what it's flat-headed or flat
bladed
rush.
Okay.
Do you know the thing that rushes are round and sedges have edges?
Yes.
It's not always true.
This is an exception. This is a rush that looks flat like an iris.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
And yeah, that's right. That is one of our favorites.
Here's a question. Do you guys cut the grasses back? Or do you just let them die down and then they come back? Because a lot of people are like, I got to remove the dead.
Yes and no.
Okay.
It depends on the grass.
Yeah.
Okay, so for instance, deer grass, we just take a rake to it. I don't think I've ever cut my deer grass, and it's been out there forever. I just take a rake underneath it and get some of the yucky stuff. Alkali grass, we do the same. June grass just flops to the ground, so we don't have to do anything to that. We have another grass that we love. That's red fescue, but it's in the margin of the redwoods.
Oh yeah, I loved that.
It's in at exactly the place it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really reseed. And we had to water the redwoods, so I put that grass that likes water there. It just kind of flops. I've never cut it. I've never stomped on it. I've never done anything, and it just does what it wants to do.
It looks
and it's
perfect there. Yeah, it found its spot. I mean, that is
right.
Yeah, when a plant finds its perfect spot, you're like, wow, that's nice.
And that's so true. When they find their perfect spot, or you happen to get lucky and put them there,
Mm-hmm.
then you don't have the maintenance problems.
Yeah, we have a lot less.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, you do. You guys try. Nothing comes out of your garden, correct? Like everything.
Yes, you are very right. This is important. And it's important because it's a lot of work to pull everything out and take it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So Pat, the very first thing Pat said, ecologically, it's better to put whatever the plant produces, if you're going to cut it, under the mother plant. And I'm going, oh yeah, that does make sense, doesn't it? So, yeah, okay. So we cut most everything in the garden and put it on the ground somewhere. That works most of the time. There are a few exceptions of working well. There are a few places where we get really bad weeds, and we have 3 or 4 places in the garden that we actually, in a pathway, put those bad weeds so that we can keep an eye on them if needed.
Mm-hmm.
And every once in a while, we get plants that take over. Now, what are you going to do with a plant that takes over that has to go somewhere? Yarrow takes over. Purple needlegrass takes over. Sometimes Melica in a good year takes over, like this year. So what we do there is we find an area in our garden that we can just put whatever we need to get rid of, like all the purple needlegrass. I usually pull out at least half the purple needlegrass every year.
Wow.
And then I put it somewhere in the garden in a kind of like giant wide pile, a foot tall wide, and we stomp on it, and then we just let it do its thing. And anything that's touching the ground doesn't have any way to get to the sun, and anything that can see the sun can't touch the ground. If you want, you could put wood chips on it. And so that's our way to kind of, and then there's just sort of a bare patch there for a while, but we don't care.
Yeah.
Bare patches are fine in our yard.
Yeah. So basically, if you prune anything, just chop it up and place it down below the mother plant. And that's just going to add to your soil and create, the environment, the plants. Because in the wild, no one's coming through and removing the plant debris.
No.
We're making wood chips.
Yeah.
No, the plant debris falls close to the plant, and that makes sense. The nutrients that are in that, as it decays, go back into the soil. Mm-hmm. And then the plant has them to reuse.
And that's good habitat.
If you haul them away, then that's defeating that,
Yeah.
And big things like big limbs and stuff we toss. They make beautiful fungus. They, as they're decomposing, they have perches. I mean, sometimes we line a path with them. I mean, all those logs and big things go into the ground.
Yeah. I mean, that's habitat for, even mason bees, right? And then
that
beetles
works.
and everything. Decomposers are gonna want to use that. Yeah. So, people are like, well, I have a small yard. It's hard to do. You could still do it if you just chomp it up a bit and just lay it on top and have it act as the mulch for you.
You can, and you can cover it with mulch if you wanted to, if you want to be. I just, in my non-native garden, chopped up a bunch of bulb tops and said, that's all right.
Yeah.
Either I'm going to cover them or not, doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's what I do with my vegetables that's gone to seed or whatever. I
Same.
just chop it up and then I'm like, well, I
Yeah.
don't like this. I'm just going to put some compost on top of it.
Exactly.
So, so let's get into some of, we talked about your grasses because I always forget about grasses, but there are a lot of native ones and they add a lot of interest too. And you mentioned some good ones, but now I want to get to your top 5 sun-loving natives, each of your top 5. And then we'll do shade. So let's hit the top 5. And I had it have you narrow it down to 5.
It's really hard.
It was hard.
Do you want some rationale as why they're the top 5 or?
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
So-
I'll go first. What is first? Sun. Okay. The first thing that came to mind for me is bee's bliss.
Ah.
It's a low-growing plant, and it
Salvia
attracts
bees bliss.
salvia bees bliss, and it attracts a variety of bees all the time. The only reason not to plant it is you're allergic to bees, I guess. My next one is, and it's very drought tolerant too, is toyon.
Mm-hmm.
It's a taller tree. It provides shade. It's beautiful evergreen leaves and provides berries that feed all sorts of things that come through.
Man, it is.
And it blooms early.
And it's indestructible.
Blooms early. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it can be pruned like however you want.
Mm-hmm.
You can prune it up as a tree or low as a whatever you want to do with it. It's very agreeable.
I'm recommending that one more and more as like a hedge for people if they want, instead of photinias, as a small tree, as a shrub, because it's beautiful. Absolutely no fuss. It takes standing water in the winter. I know this because it was growing along a culvert, but then also no summer rain or irrigation at all once it's established.
It gets a little raunchy, but it comes right back.
Yeah.
And don't forget, it comes in both red berries and the golden berry,
True. Mm-hmm.
which is fun too.
And the golden one is named Davis variety, so you can always remember that.
Yeah.
Another one that's real similar to toyon, and in ways, it's got some variety to it, is coffeeberry.
Mm-hmm.
And it does many of the same things in the garden. It's a little bit smaller when it maxes out, but not much. And you can make a hedge out of that or prune it any way you want. Same thing.
And don't forget the pretty berries. So it has 3 different kinds of berries at the same time.
Yeah.
Red, green, and black.
Yeah. So it produces its berries continuously over quite a while, which is good for birds that want to eat them too. I love the manzanitas. There's so many different kinds, and their bark is wonderful. Their flowers are so sweet. And you can get big ones, tall ones, or shorter ones.
Can I interject and feel like
Sure.
this is one that a lot of people kill?
Yes.
Yeah.
and like the arbutus, the strawberry tree, that's a tree. That one does well, but the low growing ones, is it a slope? Is it raised, planted high and a slope? Is that the key?
I think so. I've had really good luck planting them on a berm that's only a foot and a half high is all.
But that's
they don't need, but it does give it more drainage.
Yeah.
So maybe that does help it.
Okay. Yeah, just that foot higher, I think would.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, so that's the key. A foot high.
I think it really needs some decent drainage.
Yeah.
It does need drainage, yeah.
Okay.
And again, not too much summer water after it's established.
Yeah.
So I have one on the flatland that's fairly new, just a couple of years. So we're going to know that pretty soon.
Okay.
But most of the most successful have been on slopes.
Yeah. Yeah. But I like the berm idea. Just a foot up might do the trick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So those are your top 5. Okay. Those are, you got some large shrubs in there. And
are you talking to me? Yeah, larger shrubs.
Yeah, larger shrubs, which is good because
I put in all the ones that return year after year after year. You can always sun loving plants. There's all sorts of seeds you can put out for flowers, but I didn't include those. The other one that I had on my list was redbud.
Oh,
California redbud.
Yeah.
It's a lovely plant.
there.
And it's very tolerant.
Okay, that could be your bonus one. So Patricia, you get 5 and a bonus.
Good. I have a bonus on the sun. So it's interesting that Pat and I did not have the same list.
I find that.
We had
I love that. I love that.
So not that we didn't agree with the other person. So in the early spring, the ribes currants are wonderful. And we have probably at least 10 or 12 different species cultivars. And they're just great. And they just brighten up the garden first thing out, usually even late winter. So I think all those are the best. The second is a new favorite for me. So it's the silverbush lupine. So we have failed at silverbush lupine in our main acre garden on the slough. But in our test garden across the way on the bike path, I put in 3 plugs from Hedgerow Farms way back in 2019, I want to say. 2020, I guess. No, 2019. And the gophers got 2, but 1 bloomed. And it was spectacular. And I thought, wow. So I, figured it would reseed itself. Well, it didn't do anything the next year, but the next year it went crazy and there were seeds everywhere. But in the back, we don't have that because we attract too many of those cool animals that Pat likes. That our habitat is
and those things.
the turkeys and the squirrels and the rats and the everything else. So, and then we've had more and more experience where this year, some of the silverbush lupins have produced like hundreds of silverbush lupin babies. And the front area is pretty much all in rainwater, and it's just amazing to me. So that's my new,
Is that one a perennial?
That one is perennial.
It is perennial. Okay. So
it makes babies.
But yeah. And it's on so what you're saying is it's on a slope. So
they are. And you know what? It's in a big open space, which means there's no shrubs for the rabbits to hide. The hawks just sit up in the trees and wait and say, okay, we're ready. So I think that it's the lack of predators has make it really easy out there.
I mean, I think it's fabulous, phenomenal. But I've always, and I think I remember from you're like, I can't get this darn thing to grow out here, but it's
not in the back.
Yeah, not in the back. So it sounds like you found that sweet spot, and all the cyclists and can enjoy it.
Yeah, no, they are. So the other ones are easier. So succulents. I have quite a few native succulents, and it's on the succulent steppe area of our coastal area. Most of the succulents are coastal, although there are some a little better inland and foothill. Dudleya palmeri is probably my all-time favorite. It starts out with cool buds and then opens up into cooler flowers. This is actually a local from hairy fruited hibiscus, which is a hibiscus that grows on the riparian area. So it usually grows by the water. So we put it usually on the water, or we put it in the margins of our redwoods, which gets a bit of water. And it's huge. It's a huge white hibiscus with a
red center.
Red center.
Yeah,
it's gorgeous. And it does beautifully here. Beautifully.
That one, it has one major bloom, correct? And it's Laura. Is it hibiscus Laura something rather? I should know this.
Laciocarpus.
Yes. Okay. We have one at work, and I had one in my last property, and yeah, it's bizarre to think we have a native hibiscus.
I know, it's just stunning. Mm-hmm. And it reseeds if you let it. And I've transplanted those little seedlings, and they do great. So yeah, no. So that's highly recommended.
I don't think that's utilized enough, personally.
I don't think it is either. Yeah. It's just gorgeous. Mm-hmm. Now, it is deciduous. It will die completely to the ground, which would turn some people off. But it comes back. It's already probably up a foot tall now, and it's just going to be gorgeous.
Yeah.
And one of the ones in the desert is the fairy dusters, Caliandra. There's 2 of them. We have the pink California fairy duster and the red Baja fairy duster. Both of those are just awesome.
And they
low water.
They don't stop blooming. especially the red one.
Well, up until this year, I agree, but that 25-degree frost kicked them back a bit. And I wasn't sure if it was going to die all the way to the ground. I knew that it would come up from the ground, but it's all the dead 2-foot tall stems actually are just starting to
we have 2 at work, and they're a little closer to a building, so I think they get the heat sink from that. But you know, I don't think they've stopped blooming in like 15 years.
Oh yeah, they're almost always in bloom. I agree with you. I think ours at least get kicked back, but they start early. And then my bonus is soap plant. I dug 2 soap plants from my childhood home west of Reading, and now we have hundreds and hundreds of soap plant. And it's just a cool plant. When the kids were young, we would go out at dusk, and they opened just at around dusk, and you can see the buds just getting ready to open, and then they pop open. And the kids just thought that was the coolest thing. So they would go, oh, I think this is the next one. And then boom, they got really good at figuring out what was going to open. Anyway, it's just a fun, and then it's also, you know, a very good plant in the native indigenous world as well. So.
Yeah, which would be, I mean, that's a whole different topic, is talking about how wonderful these, you know, the history of these plants as far as how, you know,
and the ethnobotany.
Exactly. I mean, my gosh, we could, I mean, that's the great thing about natives is, you know, you could grow them, they're beautiful, but they are so useful to, and just the history of them. Okay, so now just real quick, because I don't want to keep you guys forever, and I do want to get to where people should shop and some books and where they could find your articles. And we already talked about this a little bit. What I consider some of the most difficult ones to grow. And that might be, you know, you're like, there's no difficult plant, there's only difficult people, but or clueless people. But, you know, I mentioned the manzanita. And it sounds like a lot of these that are difficult might be because you're just not planting them according to where they want to grow. But what are some of your nemesi, whatever you say? What are, go ahead.
I'm just going to, I have one only really.
Okay.
We talked about grasses already. And so that was one of them, but the other are annuals. You think you just toss out those seeds and they're just going to come up and just do what mine actually sometimes does. And that doesn't happen that way. If they manage to get through all the pests, I mean, if they germinate in the first place, if they get through all the pests, great. If they come up, then and set seeds and actually come back the next year, they won't come back where you want them to. They'll come back everywhere you don't want them to. We have found them to be very challenging. And then to make things, you get it in a place where it's really happy, and then the sun is shade or the shade is sun. And you're going, oh, okay, now that's not good anymore. So we just found, we love the look. It's a cool look when it works, but it's a lot more difficult. I think I would encourage most beginners to start with perennials and bulbs, not with grasses, and not, well, grasses, but well-behaved grasses. And then,
well, I think
anyway,
the annuals, what I find is, you know, maybe if you get them started, but then one becomes dominant quickly. And it pretty soon you may only have tidy tips. And I speak from experience at work where that's all we had. And
okay,
I know.
We can't get that one to grow.
You can't get that one to grow. That's so bizarre.
But we have other ones that have had a succession thing almost going on in there. We had red maids taking over the whole valley grassland for a while, and then the blue-eyed grass took over a lot of the red maids, and now we have meadow foam taking over both of them. So there's constantly, I guess the thing is that we've learned that nature's going to take her course, and some things are going to grow better in certain places than others. And the easiest thing is to just appreciate them. For what they did, what they're doing.
And I'm wondering if, because I had meadow foam, this tiny mimulus, this tiny lupine on my last property. And, you know, some like they liked the low, just a slight indentation in the ground where just that water pooled, you know, for that year. So it's just bizarre how some of these species will congregate or go to and pop up. Maybe one year they won't pop up, but then you have a wet year and then they just take over. So, it's really dependent on the rains. But I do want to just briefly, for people who do want to try annuals, just some quick tips of when to sow. Do you mix in peat moss with it? Do you just throw them on top? Do you rake them under?
I plant them like you would plant a carrot.
Oh, wow.
I think that's been generally the most successful.
Okay.
There are a few that I start in pots and I transplant. Clarkias will transplant well. Believe it or not, tidy tips will. And we put 3 in to pretend that we can grow tidy tips. I know. The neighbor has a field of native annuals, and her tidy tips are crazy every year, but we cannot grow tidy tips. Pat loves her favorite Chinese houses.
Oh yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Valencia, yeah. So you guys find that direct sowing, like burying the seed or starting in pots, is better than just casting them on top and then either watering
Walk
them
away?
or letting the rains
It-
water them.
I don't.
It depends. Some of them you can just toss out and they'll germinate like
Yeah.
crazy. If you happen to toss them out at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
And that would mean we'd all be better at predicting the weather. I don't know.
Exactly.
Or the birds that
The
are going to come
birds.
through and
Yeah.
eat the seeds.
Yeah,
And
something's going to eat
some of
them.
them seem to like to be tossed into wood chips or something for protection.
Some do.
Yeah.
And some of them won't tolerate any wood chips.
Yeah.
They're all like different.
Yeah, and some of them really like to be tossed out in summer so they can get kind of baked in the sun and crunched on a few times and whatever. And some of them, by then, if you toss them in the summer, they'll be gone by the time the rains come. So this is difficult.
Yeah. So I guess what we're saying is, we clump these plants all into annuals, but if you look, a lot of them are going to grow in different slightly areas where their requirements are different. So it's not, I guess it's just don't treat them all the same, which we do, even as, you guys,
Nope.
even as expert gardeners, we know better because we're like, oh, they're annuals. They're going to grow under, in the wet areas and they're growing good this time. But yeah, it's all those slight variations in just where they grow. I mean, you could see a huge swath of something growing on one south exposure. And then right around the corner on an east exposure will be another annual.
Yep.
And you're like, well, that makes sense. One likes it warmer, one likes it. So I guess that's why we like gardening, because it's still a challenge, no matter if you guys are experts.
But you know what? Nature really is in charge, just to let you know.
Correct. Oh, yeah, fully. I agree. Okay, so Patricia, that's sort of your nemesis is annuals. Pat? What is your difficult to grow?
I have to agree with that. They're the ones. And I mean, and we have tried all sorts of different things. We've tried covers for them, the black plastic trays that are about a foot by a foot or maybe 18 inches by 18 inches that you get in the nursery when you buy a bunch of plants, putting those over them. We've, there's just all
chicken wire cages.
There's all sorts of reasons they'll disappear,
Yeah. And that's a good point you make, because a lot of times you do have germination. Things get to them, and then you think, they didn't germinate, but it's in fact the birds, the rabbits. Yeah.
The snails, the slugs, any of those things. Yeah.
Yeah. And if it's lupin, you can count on even more things because everyone loves lupin sprouts.
So really protect
Pea
them.
sprouts.
Just be aware, cover them if you have rabbits. And birds are, people don't think about birds, but they go and just pull them or strip them. Yeah.
And rats, everything.
Yes. All right, let's get into where
You aren't going to ask us really about our shade-loving natives?
Oh, I skipped that. Yes, shade loving. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we love shade.
Yeah,
especially in the summer. Yeah, go, Patricia.
Okay, so hound's tongue. I have always been enthralled with hound's tongue, which you cannot find anywhere, at least I couldn't. So I finally decided to start it from seed, and I have been successful. It's finally growing. It grows under oaks.
Okay.
It's just, I don't know, a cool little plant. But I failed at first because the first year from seed, you get 2 little leaves, and I thought, and then it dies. And I thought, oh, that didn't work. And I threw it away. But that's right. It takes, 2 leaves and then 7 leaves and then 25 leaves. And eventually it blooms. And so Anyway, and Pat and I are both going to say this one, Pacific Coast Hybrid Iris.
I guess.
Those are so much fun. And we've had them cross all the time, and we'll get something new, and it's just so much fun. Right now they're blooming, and we propagate them all the time.
So when we say shade, this means that they either handle little morning sun, all day bright light, or pretty dense shade, you would say?
Each one are slightly different, but yeah. So Pacific Coast hybrids can take morning sun easily. They don't really like blasty afternoon.
Okay.
Hound's tongue is under oak trees, dense shade, pretty dense.
Okay.
Tiger lily, we have a tiger lily on our little creek in the shade.
Yeah.
And it's in the shade. We have a little creek that was constructed after the 2017 flood, gouged out an area, took out the succulent steps and everything. And two of the interns that we had helped me make this little creek. And the tiger lilies are happy right in the bottom of it. But we call it Schley Creek because it's the initials of the two people that helped, their first and last initials. The red fescue we already talked about, the one in the redwoods, that's just so wonderful. And Pat's going to say ferns, but I just went to maidenhair fern. I've had troubles with some fern, but that little maidenhair fern, Capillaris veneris or whatever it is, it looks like it's so delicate, and it's like the one thing I can count on spreading and never killing.
And this is important that you mentioned the species Capillaris veneris, because there are different maidenhair ferns that are adapted.
That's true.
And this is one where you may think you've killed it, but it will come back. It comes back
and be bigger.
Yes. Mm-hmm. No, those are all going. I love the tiger lily. That's Lilium parviflora.
Yeah, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
And then the hounds. I think is that Cynoglossum? I think it's Cynoglossum.
Yeah, that's it.
Yes. No, those are different. You don't find those, but man, that lily is gorgeous. Yeah.
I know the tiger lily's worth it. I mean, those are easy to find. You can find those pretty easily. We just happen to have it in the right spot for some reason.
All right, Pat.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked about ferns. Maidenhair fern is great. Sword fern, I like. The giant chain fern is beautiful. They all do better they'll take a little bit of morning sun, but they really do prefer some pretty much shade.
Yeah. And
actually the sword fern is more adaptable. It can be sort of at the edge of redwoods and do just fine.
Do you know the genus of sword fern? Is the chain fern's Woodwardii? I don't know the species.
Yeah. Patricia, do you know the sword fern?
I can look it up while you keep talking.
Okay. And in contrast with the ferns that are a little bit taller, I love the redwood sorrel. It's just a low ground cover. It makes a really cute little pink flower.
And that's sort of no fuss, and it just spreads nicely.
It seems to. And I've had it in a place where I only water once a month in the summer.
Wow.
And it'll wilt and look awful, but it will come back.
Yeah.
So it's more tolerant than some of the other shade things as far as water's concerned. We haven't talked about this very much, but sometimes we're just doing individual species. But there's a place in the garden out there where it's under oak trees, and there's two species that grow together. Actually, there's three. But the two that I love growing together are bleeding hearts and hummingbird sage. I don't know. There's something about the way those come up in the spring. They're just really pretty. And with
the iris thrown in.
And then we have the Douglas iris that we already mentioned around that. And it's an area where they're all growing on top of each other, and it's just lovely.
And so the bleeding heart's Dicentra formosa, I believe, and that it dies down. Yeah. And then Salvia spathacea is the hummingbird sage, which is a really tough, meaning it does wonders in your yard, and the flowers are just nonstop. And I could see how it mixes well, because the two-toned of pink.
And I mean, there's other mixtures, but we didn't talk about mixtures. But if they have the same water requirements and microclimate, they're happy in the same place, you can mix them, and that's fun.
Yeah. It's okay if you can't. You got the name?
No, I got it. Yeah. So Western sword fern is Polysticum.
Yes. Okay.
Unitum.
Okay.
We've missed another fern, the polypody.
Oh, we forgot polypodia.
Yeah, so the polypody, there's one that's called Sarah Lehman, which is a sterile hybrid of two different ones, Californicum and I don't know what the other one, Glycera, something or other. Anyway, it's summer deciduous.
Okay.
But it's just come back for 10 years? It just comes back and it's so
Wow.
pretty.
Okay.
It survived all those 5 years of drought that we had consecutively.
That's good to know.
When Patricia went to New Zealand and left me, was trying to figure stuff out, and it was a champion. It survived on its own.
It did. It was one of the few.
Yeah.
And that's polypody.
And you know what?
Okay.
Yeah. Well, polypody in general, but this is a cross, the Sarah Lehman, Lyman, Sarah Lehman. It's a slight different one, but I do have just plain polypodies too, which I highly recommend. You know what? We didn't talk about something that Pat and I learned about drought.
Go for it.
So when Pat was here all alone, struggling with 5 years of drought, and I was happily in New Zealand enjoying myself.
And nobody else knew what to do with the drought either at that time. It was like none of us had experienced that.
So what we tried to do the first year was see if the rains would come, see if the rains would come. They didn't, so we better water, which usually ended up being about March, April, May, which is a bad time to water the natives because... Or
even later. I think the first year I didn't water till June.
Oh, okay. Even worse.
And we totally missed the window of opportunity there.
You keep going because you solved it.
Yeah, and that's what most of us did because, we did want to water because we thought it was going to rain because it always had, and we didn't want to waste the water. And so we didn't. But what happened was that we realized after a while was that these plants are adapted to a certain rainfall pattern that most of the time happens. And in California, that had been, November, December, January, a little bit in February, a little bit in March, and maybe some into April even, and sometimes in May. But all those, when we cut the water, or when the weather cut the water off, and we didn't have that rain, we didn't know enough to try to mimic the original rain pattern for where these plants would have grown naturally. And so now what we try to do is if we don't get water, like this year particularly, our water sort of stopped in December? Continue to water, turn the water on, and water in January, February, and where do we water to now?
I went into March.
A little bit into March. Yeah.
Because by March, March is the last third of our water usually for this year. And then now we can treat it like a normal year where in the summer, some of our areas are watered once a month.
Wow.
With an inch of rain. When I water, I put an inch of rain on or inch of water.
How do you measure that?
Well, we mostly do sprinklers, so it's easy.
Okay.
Because drip is a problem. But even drip, you can actually, there are ways to measure, but we measure with cans of water.
Got it.
And I use a stick too. If you can't stick a stick down in the ground 6 or 8 inches, you haven't put on enough water.
Got it.
There's another thing that happened to us one year too, is one of the drought years is when we didn't get water on, it dried out down far, and then we could never get the water we put on to meet the water that was down lower. So if you get that dry band in there, that's what happened to us last year. And that was when I think I've lost some of my ceanothus also, and a few other trees and shrubs, because we put the water on, but there had been already that dry band down there that didn't want to get wet.
Got it.
So I think that's how we lost a few things as well. Well, I know I did.
It sounds it makes so much sense. And it just sounds like, duh. I mean, I mean, I would never, I know, but it's like, it took you guys telling me that I'm like, oh yeah, just if you don't get rain, this is when they're supposed to get rain. And then this is when they don't get rain. So this month that they don't get rain, give them some rain.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and then the other thing is, if you're going to water them in the summer to try to make it up,
Yeah.
you're going to kill the plant because
Exactly.
they don't want that much rain. They want summer.
They don't want
And a
summer
lot of
rain,
times they're
yeah.
not actively growing, and it's like a succulent. When you give water to a non-active growing plant, you
It's
run
not
the
gonna be
risk.
happy.
Yeah, it's not going to be happy. So,
No.
yeah, that makes
So we
sense.
became a lot smarter, and since we're doing it again this year, so when I have people come to our rambles, they always ask, "How much do you water? When do you water?" Da, 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 da. And I have to tell them, we water at the end of the month. If we haven't had the water, we pretend that we're going to make it water,
Yeah.
and we do that every month. And then I have a really nice chart for our area. No, it's really good.
Yeah.
There was a person, Emily from the Arboretum, put together a chart of what our rainfall is, what our evapotranspiration is, and then it kind of breaks down how much you have to put in if you're going to water once a week or once a month or whatever.
Huh. I just emailed Emily today, so I need to email her again to get that chart.
No, you need my chart because mine's been adapted.
Oh, okay.
Mine's the adapted chart. Emily, yeah. But I took that, and she has all the credit at the bottom.
Oh.
But I adapted it to very drought tolerant versus low water versus high water, like redwoods and stuff. And it tells you basically how much water you generally need in a typical year. But guess what? We're not typical anymore.
No, we're not.
Probably need some more adaptations.
Yeah, that's it. It's like, what is typical these days?
That is a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem. Yeah. And I guess you guys are pushing to see the limits of how little you could water. That seems to be, you guys are using your garden.
Yeah, it's, and the plants are going to suffer. Ideally, I would love to water my redwoods every week for an inch. I last year watered them every 2 weeks. They survived. They were happy. The understory is not happy.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why, like you're saying, they're not adapted, but you inherited them. Let's go on to just, where can people shop for natives, and what are let's take that. Because sometimes people go to the big box store and there's like, hey, drought tolerant or natives. And like I was saying, they may put tropical milkweeds in with native milkweeds, since that's their business is selling and not necessarily education.
We are so lucky now. We have so many more local area places to go. Morning Sun now has a lot of natives, which is in Vacaville. Redwood Barn has a lot of natives. What's something in Lark that's out at the cannery? They're starting to sell natives.
Oh, really?
What is it? Something in Lark.
Okay. That's okay. I can look.
Okay, Lemuria does, which is in Dixon. My money goes everywhere.
Yeah.
UC Davis Arboretum sells lots and lots. And then I also go to 2 different local chapters, Sacramento and Solano, which is close to me. I'm on the border of those.
And you're talking about the California Native Plant Society chapter.
Yeah, they have their chapter sales.
Yeah.
So those are places I go locally. And then I mail order a whole lot of places because if you're going to buy, people have been asking me this so much that I'm updating my list right now, actually, of where do I buy all this stuff. But bulbs, we have, I don't know how many different geophytes we have. We have a lot. And Britton Becky bulbs, which is, I think, in Oregon. Van Engelen, which is a regular wholesale bulb place, but they have a lot of natives too. And the thing is, you have to be educated. It doesn't say California native.
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot. Yeah, another mail order is Annie's Annuals. They do a good job too. Easy to Grow Bulbs is actually in Southern California, and they have quite a few as well. So,
what about Digging Dog Nursery?
Digging Dog, I love them. I use them too. Yeah, they not as much in natives, but they have some great New Zealand plants. And so, I'm sorry. And then seeds. I buy a lot of seeds. Larner is a typical one. They've been around for years, like they're in the Bay Area somewhere. But there's two others. Well, I use actually even more, but these Seed Hunt. Jenny is just a delightful person. And Seed Hunt has got all sorts of stuff of natives.
Okay.
And Wild Seed is God, I've used them long before I grew natives. But they also sell a lot of in bulk. Oh, Peaceful Valley sometimes does seeds in bulk as well of natives. So, and I now have an ongoing list of things I want. And my friends who go to the Bay Area, they go, Patricia, I'm heading to, East Bay natives. Yes. And then I'm going to pick up, I just got some trilliums finally because I've been looking for them, but we can't find trilliums here. But in East Bay, they have them. So everybody has my list and they give me of what I'm looking for. So anyway, there's lots and lots of easy places to find things now.
Pat, do you agree? Is there any, you guys didn't mention Cal Flora out in
yeah, I've been to Cal Flora.
Okay.
That's up in
Sebastopol, isn't it? Yeah. Sebastopol.
Yeah. I spent a lot of money there one day.
Yeah.
Pat.
Yeah, I don't have, the only thing
She
I might
doesn't
add,
buy.
I don't.
She's not the buyer.
I'm not the big buyer. Sometimes the master gardeners will have a native plant table
right.
at some of their
Right, they
sales.
do.
The one in Woodland.
And of course, a lot of
Right.
these plants you could take cuttings of or get seeds off of.
Right.
Yeah.
We do that all the time.
We could say that Patricia Carpenter's garden is a really good place to shop.
Exactly.
We have picked up, we have moved plants from there to so many places. So
a lot of people have come out and taken plants that they've needed, and we share all the time.
Yeah. So where you mentioned California Native Plant Society, people could join their local chapter, and they do a lot of talks, and like you said, they had plant sales. But what are some references and books, including your articles, Pacific Horticulture, and online sites for natives just perusing? Because people they're like, of course they're going to listen to this and learn so much, but then
Okay, well, back when we started in 2005, it was a little trickier, but now life is simple. So I often go to Cal Flora and I find out which plant community it's in. That's useful. And then you can just link right over to Calscape and it tells you how to grow it. So those are online, easy places to start. And then I usually go to a nursery or two that I think are really good. There's some of the, like Cal Flora's website's good, Las Palitas website.
I was going to mention
and you can get more information. And amazingly, all the information is not the same. Who knew?
Yeah.
There'll be something interesting new. And then I have, back before all those websites, I had books and books and books. So I was thinking, okay, what would be my thought of books? There's one book that I highly recommend as a beginner book. It's called California Native Plants for the Garden. And it's got a blue-eyed grass on the cover. It's Carol Bornstein, David Floss, and Bart O'Brien. It's a super introduction. Mine is well used.
I loaned mine out, and I don't know who I loaned it out to, so mine's gone.
That is bad. I keep track of that one. And then I love this book. It's called Wild Lilies, Irises, and Grasses. It's all about monocots. And it's from Nora Harlow and Kristen Jacob. They were the editors. I use it all the time. And the other one is a little trickier, but you will have a whole new appreciation of how California native plants have been used over the years. And that is Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson. I go to it because it tells me all sorts of things that I probably should have known. And when I get into trouble, she often solves the problem.
Ooh,
it's not really a book about growing per se. It's a more ethnobotany in a way. But, in order to use a plant, you kind of got to grow it first.
Yeah.
And so it's just been, I find it very useful. So those would probably be
that out. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually have a signed copy from Pat when she first came out. It's just, yeah. Anyway, I mean, I literally, if you go to one of my, one of the articles, we address this, how we go about trying to get plants and stuff. And I have a stack of books, and that picture of a stack of books that I had before the websites came out. And everyone has.
Where are your articles at? Pacific Horticulture, if they go online, can they just find them? Or do
They
you have
could.
to be, okay.
They could. Yeah, they're free.
Okay. So it's under pacifichorticulture.org.
Yeah.
Do you know?
I don't know. I can send you a link to put it on, but
Okay.
let's see.
Yeah, you could send me a link and I'll put it under the show notes. That works.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, I can send you where you can get all 5 at once, and then you don't have to go in circles.
That's right, because there's 5 seasons. That's right.
Yeah, I mean,
you just did that to get an
anywhere.
extra article. You're like, actually, no, there's 6 seasons. No,
no, it was a lot of work writing those articles, right, Pat?
Yes, no. Yeah, I'm sure it was. Pat,
do
you have any other books or sites? I know Las Politas, Calflora, and like you said, Calscape. Those are all really.
I've used Annie's Annuals. They have some good descriptions of plants.
I agree.
It's very user friendly.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of natives now.
Yeah, she has a huge native California native plant section. So yeah. I mean, there's a lot. It's like you said, years ago, none of this existed. It was crazy. It was all books, and then you had to go to the library or buy the books at a bookstore and and hope that it had, the plants and the information that you wanted. And the buying plants was just crazy. It was only the local nurseries around you. And now it's online, and you could communicate with people who have a plant in, online. So it's changed. Like, it's changed a lot of industries. It's changed the plant industry. And, I don't think there's any detriment, except for the one thing is, you mentioned the deadlies. And unfortunately, that's one California plant that is poached incredibly bad. And if it wasn't for the internet, I mean, there'd still be poaching. There's always been poaching since people want plants and they knew there were plants. They would send people out. But, of course, it just spreads faster with the ability to communicate. So this was great. I mean, we could talk forever, and, I'll probably have you on again, and we'll talk more like specific plants maybe. And, but I mean, I think this is really helpful, and it was really interesting. And, I'll have notes on where your articles are at, because I think people would like to read those.
Also, there's a link to the California Native Plant Society Garden Ambassadors. I have a profile. You can actually kind of see. There's a map of the garden and a little mini pictures. Also, I could give you a link to best pictures.
Yeah, I'll put those links, because people are going to want to see this garden we've been talking about. And I mean, it's pretty freaking amazing. And
well, thank you.
You are the Energizer Bunny.
You have to understand that Marlene saw it in early spring.
Wow.
So,
I mean, that's where, but remember, in fall, it's gorgeous too. Remember, we're selling.
We think so. No, we think so. Actually, just before the pandemic, we opened our garden in the winter.
Oh.
And everybody was so excited to come in the spring. And, in the winter, and we do this rain or shine. Was that the one, Pat, that it was actually raining? I think it was.
I don't know. We've had slogging through mud days, but
yeah, we've had some of those days. Okay. But we figured, who cares? So, but I was so thrilled that we had gotten the point across that, okay, it looks good here. I mean, it was winter, but they were excited. And then people who are excited, I mean, I've had people in the spring go, summer? Yeah, I'm ready. Yeah. I'm going, okay, you're in for it.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's different things to see all season long in every garden.
I agree.
And, it's just taking in the beauty. And I tend to think that a winter garden is more, atmospheric, especially like you said, if you bring in some fog and some mist and, and then you see it in spring and you're like, wow, it's completely different feel. That's what's amazing about it, is you get these different feelings from just being in the same spot in a garden, just different seasons.
I do have one other thing to say, though.
Sure.
When we have opened our garden, at first, since it's a native garden event, we only open the native garden. And of course, I have my garden non-native garden close by. And, you know, gardeners don't like to stop at fences and gates. And so they'd be, you know, looking in the garden thinking, oh gosh, I should be going in that garden too. Eventually, we started opening up the main garden as well. And what we really think is important is the contrast, seasonal contrast between a more native garden and non-native garden is educational.
Mm-hmm.
It's just really nice to see the difference.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Each season. So,
yeah. I mean, every garden has something to offer and something to teach.
Yeah.
But, you know, a lot of our non-native gardens are sort of, when they go dormant, I mean, unless you have a lot of shrubs, they tend to just be sort of there, where if you have a native garden, you know, you could have different structures and different, you know, shapes and sizes and of shrubs. So
anyway, the contrast I think has been good for people. So we do open it as well, but the focus is on the natives.
Yeah. All right. So everyone, if you've liked this, share this so people can learn about California natives. And of course, if you're not in California, some of these plants will definitely still fit into your area. Of course, check your zone, check your plant community, see if these plant communities fit in with your zone. And until next time, everyone, happy gardening.